Good afternoon, and welcome to Dodds Auditorium in Robertson Hall here at Princeton. I'm Cecilia Rouse, and I'm the Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and we're thrilled to welcome former Chairman of the Federal Reserve, founder of the Volcker Alliance, Paul Volcker, from the great Princeton class of 1949. He's come back to campus. So Paul served as 2 terms of chairman of the Fed under Presidents Carter and Reagan, where he's credited with bringing high inflation to an end. And after the 2008 financial crisis, he served as an economic advisor to President Obama and as chairman of the Economic Recovery Advisory Board, otherwise known as the PRAB. During this time, he worked tirelessly on the design of legislation to reform the oversight of our financial system that ultimately became the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act. In particular, he's credited with advocating for a rule that to prohibit proprietary speculative trading activity by banks or bank-owned institutions for their own gain rather than for the benefit of the consumer. This rule has become known as the Volcker Rule, and it is scheduled to go into effect this April. In 2013, he launched the Volcker Alliance to address ineffective public policies and distrust in government. Paul has degrees from Princeton and Harvard and the London School of Economics, and has held multiple prominent positions in the public and private sectors. Please join me in welcoming Paul Volcker back to Princeton.
Thank you, Celia, and ladies and gentlemen, students, faculty, whatever. It's nice to be back in this, I don't know how old you have to be hallowed, but a hallowed hall. It's not that old. But these days, let me say, I've been trying to avoid speaking engagements. But the simple fact is, Celia Rouse's letter of invitation totally undermined all my defenses. How could I resist participating in a Woodrow Wilson School Good Governance lecture series? Specifically, the purpose is to examine, and I quote, the current state of the United States governing bodies and whether they are meeting the needs of our citizens. In that context, my speech can be both definitive and exceedingly short. The current state of our governance bodies is poor. Quite simply, they are not meeting the needs of our citizens. Are there any questions? If you're not quite prepared, let me go on and prime the pump a bit. Now, effective governance, as Celia suggested, has been a preoccupation of mine for a long time. I spent most of my working life in government. I've seen enough of it from the inside to know something of the immense satisfactions, along with the inescapable frustrations of public service. But beyond any personal experience, I've never doubted the importance of effective government or the need for constant vigilance by our public leaders, by our educational institutions, and by our citizens generally. But today, as you can sense, those simple propositions are questioned. A certain sense of skepticism about government is, and it should be, part of our American heritage and experience. It was rooted, in fact, in the checks and balances in our Constitution. But I'm afraid it's also true that what was healthy skepticism seems to have settled into cynicism and a kind of corrosive distrust. And there, I think we have a problem. No democracy, no government of the people, by the people, for the people, and Abraham Lincoln's stirring words can flourish or long exist if the people themselves have lost confidence in the governing processes. Now, I'm not going to let you dismiss my concern by chalking it up to a grumpy old man, harking back to some presumably glorious earlier days. The fact is, the evidence is all around us. Virtually every poll tells us the same story of disenchantment. Varies only as to whether it is the Congress or the President that ranks lowest in popular esteem. There's the oft-cited poll, repeated over the years, and I'll repeat it once more, that asks one simple question. Do you trust your government to do the right thing most of the time? Doesn't sound like the toughest examination question in the world. But these days, the answer to that question lies around 20%. The cynics among you may suggest 20% is good enough for government work. But I have to tell you, it's not evidence of a vibrant, healthy democracy. Or I can suggest an entirely different kind of evidence, bearing on our democratic processes. I'm told that today, 3 out of the 4 most affluent counties in the United States are those surrounding Washington, D.C., which itself has become, over the past generation, an island of prosperity. An island of prosperity built on the wealth of lobbyists, law firms, and government contractors. I'm told that today, 70% or so of congressional staffers leaving their positions take jobs as lobbyists, a multiple of what was the case 2 decades ago. The excesses of campaign financing, the seeming acceptability of gerrymandering, the passive pandering to one-issue voters, I could go on and on. But the only relevant question is what to do about it. And it's not a question for me more than it is for you who are here at one of America's most prestigious educational institutions. Now, I know that the Woodrow Wilson School, with its counterparts at other great universities, is actively engaged in debate and research about issues of public policy, large questions of national security, of poverty and income inequality, health care, international relations, the environment, on and on. It's all interesting and challenging stuff. But I have a question. How much attention is being paid to how to get something done, to practically implement the big ideas, to achieve a degree of effectiveness and efficiency in the provision of necessary public services? Because without a sense of good and fair public management, how can we expect to restore trust? And not so incidentally, justify the level of taxation needed to support the agreed policies and services. Long ago, Alexander Hamilton, in writing his Federalist Papers, made a forceful point succinctly, and I quote him, "The true test of good government is its aptitude to produce a good administration." I recently ran across an aphorism by a great American inventor 100 years ago or so, Thomas Alva Edison. In only 5 words, he encapsulated the challenge of translating policy into government. And I quote him, "Vision without execution is hallucination." That is a simple lesson that I fear too often, even in this institution, has been ignored. Now, permit me in that connection an anecdote from 25 years ago. That to me illustrates the point. I was here in Princeton. I was walking with an economics professor toward Robertson Hall, and I mentioned I thought too little attention was being paid here at Princeton to the challenge of public administration. His spontaneous reply was, and I quote to the best of my memory, "That is not an appropriate matter for a great university. Public administration is not an intellectual discipline and science like economics." I refrained from asking him how his latest forecasts were doing. Passing over those demonstrable limitations of the science of economics, I responded that as an undergraduate in the class of 1949, I respected the fact that the then president of Princeton was a well-known professor of public administration. My interlocutor was unyielding. This great university, he said, would not have a professor of public administration as president. Now, that particular professor has a lecture hall called Dodds Hall. We're in it. But the obvious question left hanging during this colloquy was whether that once leading American scholar of public administration, Woodrow Wilson himself, could have made the cut. Well, I've come to understand that the very words public administration conjure up a dull image of unimaginative bureaucracies, mired in routine and stultifying procedures. Rather, public attention and academic interest should be directed toward the big ideas, toward high policy, toward vision. Let's consider one lesson right before our eyes these days. The whole of President Obama's great vision of universal health care was placed in jeopardy precisely by embarrassing failures in implementation. Now, hopefully that's being corrected, but it's only one and the latest example of the problem. Do you remember the massive failure of the Office of Emergency Management in responding to the destruction of Hurricane Katrina a few years ago, undermining the reputation of that administration? Or consider the offshore oil spill, which disclosed for all to see that government monitors and safety precautions were really lacking. More important now, and right in my own bailiwick, failure in financial regulation and supervision contributed to the worst recession in a couple of generations and led to the expenditure of more than $1 trillion government dollars. Now, I could go on, but the relevant question for me and for a great university, if I may say so, is what to do about it. And I decided last year to take one small step. Helped and encouraged by a few friends, I started a new institute, which come to be called the Volcker Alliance. Now, the important part of that name is alliance, because we want to join forces with other institutions that share our concerns and our objectives with respect to improving government performance at all levels, federal, state, and local. Now, I know that's a challenge as large as all outdoors. We cannot be more than a catalyst, a rallying point for interested parties, a sponsor for promising research, encouraging new ideas and new approaches, not least toward the educational process itself. As we got underway, it became evident that we touched a sensitive nerve, not just in the United States, but in other democracies. There is a sense that thinking about public management and education for public service needs attention, a serious rethink. It needs fresh ideas. And I know from the response that we have potential partners in both Europe and Asia who share these goals. The former UK Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in launching his Africa Governance Initiative, emphasized a point that I think goes along the same lines. He says it's one thing to have vision about where you want to take a country, but the really hard part is putting in place the machinery that will make it happen. Now, I realize that may all sound impossibly naive, beyond imagination, and maybe less than intellectually stimulating in the views of many. But in the spirit of the old Chinese maxim that a long journey must start with a single step, let me set out 2 steps that I see as priorities for the Alliance today. The first does, in fact, deal with the federal financial regulatory structure. That structure has had well-known weaknesses for years. 7 or 8 independent agencies, each with entrenched bureaucracies, overlapping and competing mandates, still open to loopholes with varying degrees of professionalism and independence, and vulnerable to regulatory capture. I count at least 20 serious governmental efforts since World War II to achieve some consolidation of those agencies. Every one resulted in failure. None of them have moved the needle. Today, in the aftermath of the financial breakdown, and given the enormous complexity and interdependence of markets, and the potential for renewed and excessive risk-taking, the need, I believe, is more obvious than ever before. So working alongside a large project of the Yale School of Management about regulatory and supervisory policy, we do plan to set out, do a lot of studying, and then set out some new proposals for reform. And we do want to draw in the best academic research and professional experience we can find. Now, somewhat similarly, the Great Recession and their own policy weaknesses have exposed state and local governments to really unprecedented and unsustainable financial pressures. Short-sighted, sometimes deliberately misleading, financial practices have undermined pension commitments to employees, forced emergency cutbacks in education and health care, neglected needed infrastructure, ultimately threatening bankruptcy as well as essential services. So working with state and local organizations, isn't it time for rationalizing financial reporting and financial practices of state and local governments? That at least was the conclusion of a 3-year study of the State Budget Crisis Task Force, which issued a final report last month. It specifically emphasized the need for more consistent, transparent, and comprehensive financial statements. The basic point is that citizens and legislators together have too often failed to understand the magnitude of the financial challenge and have neglected to observe the discipline that is required for sound budgetary and financial planning. Now, those are one-off steps in the journey we've set out on. More important, ultimately, are going to be continuing efforts in 2 directions. The first requires attention to developing and extending ways and means of setting reasonable goals for government services, the importance of collecting meaningful measures of performance, setting goals, and using the data to guide progress toward those goals. It's partly a matter of effectively utilizing new technology, but it's not just a technological problem, it's a management challenge. Success will depend on cooperation with both educational institutions and think tanks, as well as governments themselves. There are, happily, quite a few examples of success in those kinds of efforts, but they need to be replicated and multiplied many times over so that they become the norm rather than the exception. Let me just take one example. The now well-known but innovative policing practices known as CompStat, resting on highly sophisticated data collection that have helped enormously in lowering crime rates in major cities. Critically important will be the cooperation with schools of public affairs, public policy, and public administration, whatever their names are, in rethinking and developing appropriate approaches toward education for public service. What, in fact, should be included in a core curriculum? How can the promising idea of internships be better developed? Perhaps particularly at the state and local levels, where students and potential interns can be close to the action. Can insured off-campus programs become significant as an add-on or even a substitute for traditional pedagogical approaches? Specifically, should not policy courses require a complement of how to do it lessons? One thing I am sure of, that these and other questions need review. The whole field of public policy, public administration needs rejuvenation. The success will depend heavily on the willingness of leading schools to participate in the effort. That's, of course, why I was intrigued and delighted by the Woodrow Wilson School's decision to hold this lecture series. As I started, concerns about governance have seldom been so pressing. The need for attention and new initiatives can't be denied. The long-cherished motto of this educational institution, Princeton in the nation's service, could not be more relevant than today. And to my mind, the Woodrow Wilson School should be the proud and concrete manifestation of that commitment. So thank you, and now you've had time to think of all those questions. Thank you.
So, if you'll entertain a question, we have two microphones.
You think I can handle these all by myself?
I don't know. They may be tough. There are two microphones. We very much love to encourage the students to ask questions.
Good afternoon. Do you think the Volcker Rule takes out the nature
Is what?
banking, as banks' nature is risk-taking, and in a way banning the proprietary investments would kind and to kind of add on to that question would be, if a solution to this would be private insurance instead of state insurance to guarantee those deposits. If a market for private insurance would be in place, would this in a way assure that the risk that these banks would be taking would be?
I don't want to make this a lecture on government regulation, but I'll say a word or two. I mean, the Volcker Rule is a terrific rule. It goes right to the heart of some of the problems. But for those of you that may not be familiar with all these matters and nuances, the Volcker Rule says banks, which are protected and supported by the government, their deposits are insured, they're members of the Federal Reserve. Governments tend to take tender, loving care of banks when they get in trouble. Those banks that have public responsibilities should not be off gambling their money and indirectly the taxpayers' money on proprietary activities that's a benefit to the officials of the bank but not to the public. Very simple concept. And it is, after a long debate, not just in the law, it's finally been incorporated in a regulation. Now, just relevant to what I said earlier, a couple of things. Why does it take 4 years after the law is passed to produce a sensible regulation carrying out the clear intent of the law? I'll tell you why. One reason is there were 5 different agencies involved looking at it from different perspectives. Most of those agencies have a collective board. One of them just has one leader. All it takes is 1 or 25 people say, I don't like this particular provision, and why don't we change it or put it in the other provision? All I know is it took 4 years. I'm told that with 400 lobbyists kind of educating these agencies about the fine points of the rule. And they're still at it around the edges. But the basic rule has been adopted. It's in the regulation. I'm sure it will stay. But the point, which I don't think is widely understood so far as my concern is, it's not just that these operations are risky and can produce losses and big losses in the banks at the worst time when you otherwise have a crisis or problems, but it creates a culture in the bank, in the organization, which is says this is a free-for-all for me to do things to make money and I will get a good bonus, and the customer, the client, comes in second. And I think there is no doubt that that kind of atmosphere has permeated the banking system in recent years with these enormous compensation practices that have rewarded risk-taking. You know, it's like the bank as a whole. A guy has a good idea, he gets enormously rewarded. He's got a bad idea, the worst that can happen to him is that he gets fired, but he probably just means he doesn't get a big bonus the next year. I think the elimination of proprietary trading will, and I'm told it does, maybe they tell me what I want to hear, it begins to change the atmosphere in the banks back toward more traditional public service functions. So, does that tell you what you want to know about the Volcker Rule? I'm not sure what you were asking about private insurance. I don't think there's much room for private insurance. When I say that, the world's biggest insurance company during the crisis failed itself, so I'm not sure that was a good omen for private insurance.
Well, you've answered my question about the delay in the implementation of the rule. Do you think the Obama administration has lost interest in pushing it and leaning on the regulatory agencies?
Well, the president was interested. That was good enough for me, eh?
Still interested?
Pardon me?
Is he still interested?
Oh, yeah, I guess I'm sure. I mean, he didn't have a big role to play once it passed the law. And the new Secretary of the Treasury was very active. You know, as part of the new law, they have this collective body, which is potentially pretty cumbersome, that the Secretary of the Treasury can get all these agencies together, 13 of them, I think, and kind of suggest what they should do. And a long time ago, the previous Secretary of the Treasury and the Treasury gave a little push and outlined what they should do in a very sensible way. And nothing happened. Jack Lew, as he became secretary, for whatever reason, happily took this on as a mission. And he pushed very hard to get the agreement among the agencies.
Hi, I was wondering what you thought the least effective government agency was, and
About what?
of the 13 government agencies, which do you think is the least effective, and would you modify that agency or would you scrap it altogether?
I'm an old man. I need a translator. The question is,
What is the least effective government agency?
or the least effective government agency? Well, I think that varies, but I'm not going to name them. I have several, but you know, the fair question to ask is what's the most effective? And when people talk about government agencies and disliking them, they can't do anything right, how many people in this room don't feel good that we have a Center for Disease Control, that when that Asian flu or pigs epidemic or whatever is at issue, you have the feeling that the world's greatest experts in this kind of thing are on the job and have done, through the time, very successful work. I mean, I don't want to talk about the Federal Reserve and its leadership, but it is important to have some agencies that people do respect and have confidence in. And I think that is very important in terms of the Federal Reserve, frankly, and that it is independent and it can spend its own money, but it's got important, delicate things to do. If you don't have confidence in that institution, it's not going to last very long, among other things. It's not going to be independent. But, you know, I can name the whole National Institutes of Health, I think, are generally, they spend a lot of money, but I don't think anybody wants to do without them and thinks they're really wasting money. Or you get very prosaic with an agency that I have experience in, Social Security Administration. Those checks come out on time, maybe that's easy. But you ask, they volunteer, they say, here's all you put into the thing, here's what you're going to get out of it, this is the future program, you punch a button and you get all the answers. if you had that effective an information system in other government agencies, we'd have fewer problems. And that's a kind of massive problem involving tens of millions of people and doing a good job. Now you can, I mean, I actually, I got some experience in this area. Medicare works more efficiently than my private insurer, if I say so, but there we are. I could go on with some others, but I'm not going to give you the worst ones. They're all worst ones, there's no doubt about it.
Sorry. What would happen at the end of February if the U.S. Treasury had to default on U.S. Treasury notes and securities? And is that relevant?
My interlocutor here.
It's up to you. She was asking what will happen if the U.S. government has to default on U.S. Treasuries.
Oh, boy.
On Friday.
I don't want to be around. I want to be actively liquidating some of my portfolio. Look, the United States isn't going to default, I do not believe. But it is not, I think, fully appreciated, something that strikes me just because of the passage of time. The United States is still in a position, the biggest, strongest economy, the most recognized point of leadership in getting things done internationally, whether it's war, peace, or the economy, or whatever. But that is not as firm a foundation today as it was back when I was a young man and in the Kennedy administration, where we could solve everything, or right after World War II, when everything was dependent upon us. And I think it's a dangerous situation politically as well as economically if the United States economy and currency is not strong enough to maintain confidence in all the foreigners that own our currency, but for a lot of other reasons as well. And we're at the situation where the natural growth of other economies makes it more difficult. We haven't got the same environment for leadership we had. We have to be even better, and we're not even better. But we don't want to run too close to the edge on the economy, on the currency, certainly on inflation. And it's very important, and we have to worry about more than the domestic political repercussions.
Thank you for coming to speak to us today. My question is, from your time in the Federal Reserve before you were chair, what did you learn from other chairmen about leading the Fed? And then when you became chair, how did you act on these lessons?
Well, you know, when I was a young fellow, you're right, I was in the Federal Reserve. Originally as an economist in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and then I was actually on the trading desk for a while. Then I was in a private bank for a while, and then I was in the Treasury, where I could kind of observe the Federal Reserve firsthand from across the street, so to speak. A man named William McChesney Martin was the chairman of the Federal Reserve during all that period for 19 years, I believe. He was a hero. He was my hero. I never thought that I would end up as chairman of the Federal Reserve. But he was a wise man, I think. And he, for many years, led the Federal Reserve to a position of respect and confidence. And in that sense, he had the leadership quality that I think is necessary and desirable in that area. He was quite a fellow. By the way, he wasn't much an economist, but he was there for 19 years.
Hi, can you comment that we all agree that we don't want financial institutions to become too big to fail, but yet the cost of regulation and the requirements for maintaining higher capital will really squeeze the true traditional banks on the community level and really require consolidation to maintain scale to be able to cover those costs? Is there a difference of ideas, and regulation is really kind of opposing the idea to keep that growth under control?
Well, how you go about regulation is partly a matter of philosophy, I guess. I was brought up in an environment, back in those years we were just talking about in the Federal Reserve and banks, where banks were probably 3/4 of the financial system. And the general idea was if you regulated the banks and protected the banks, you didn't have to worry much about the rest of the financial system because it wasn't that important and it was basically relying upon the banks anyway. Now today, banks are a much smaller proportion of the financial system, maybe 30% or so. And that certainly raises a question of how you regulate them and how you regulate the system generally. But I still stick to the idea that the banks do have a particular responsibility that we talked about earlier. It has benefits. It has benefits that they would not have admitted earlier, but they admit now because the biggest so-called investment banks, threatened with failure in the crisis, decided they better become a commercial bank and have access to the Federal Reserve and deposit insurance and all the rest and get inside the tent. And well, the crisis is over, but I don't see them walking outside the tent because they obviously think it is economically, they'd be critical that they stay inside the tent. So I continue to believe if you protect that part of the system, you don't have to be so intrusive as the rest of the system. Now, some of the other institutions are big enough and have enough concern so that they're going to get some oversight and surveillance more than they did in the past. And a lot of that regulation, I don't want to get in the area of which agency is best or not, but the non-banking part had a particular responsibility by the SEC. And whether the SEC was sufficiently preoccupied with their supervisory and regulatory responsibilities as opposed to chasing miscreants and conflicts of interest and insider trading and that kind of thing, and reading all the prospectuses, that's what they like to do, and that's part of their responsibility. I'll come back and say, without going into detail, the present regulatory structure stinks. Does that put it clearly enough? And but getting it changed is not going to be easy, and we can debate all day about how to change it.
Thank you for your remarks. In light of your comments on regulatory overlap and how much regulation stinks, I'd be interested to hear your comments on the new Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. What role you think this newest seat at the table should play, if it should even have a seat at the table? Thank you.
Well, in terms of that question, one of the possibilities for reform, and that particular change is in that direction. That's the major difference that was made in Dodd-Frank, independent consumer regulatory thing, where it had been divided up among some of these other agencies, including the Federal Reserve, and arguably none of them thought it was their primary responsibility, and it didn't get the attention that it should have. That's one example. The Treasury, interesting enough, before the crisis, had devoted a lot of effort, Secretary Paulson, to developing a revised federal regulatory structure, precisely what I'm talking about. And they were ready to put this out and try to get it in legislation. The crisis hit and it was all forgotten about. But one of their approaches, which I think really deserves examination, is to take what they call business protection functions, which would include the consumer, the interaction of a financial institution with its customers, not with its customers, but with consumers. That includes the traditional stuff that the SEC does, and separate that from the regulatory and supervisory financial agencies, and do that separately, so that the focus is clear. And there may be conflicts with the other agencies, but they ought to be fought out instead of hidden within a single agency. But that is an interesting idea, and in a way, we're halfway there because of that agency. And I'm no expert on how it's working, but I think it's doing okay, is my impression.
Hi. So I'm just curious, if you were still chairman of the Federal Reserve during the recent recession,
I can imagine that.
would you have done anything differently than Mr. Bernanke? And furthermore, are there any additional policies, either on the monetary policy side or the fiscal side, that you think the government still could implement?
I'm sure the question started out, if I were the chairman of the Federal Reserve, I would what?
Would you do anything differently?
Would do anything differently?
And would you have done something differently on either the fiscal side, which the Fed doesn't control, or the monetary?
It's an unanswerable question. I have to be there to know. I thought you were going The only question I was prepared for is, what grade do you give Mr. Bernanke? I thought when I was here, everybody got an A. And so that applies in this case. Now, if you really are forced, as I read, I don't know how real it is, if you're forced to mark on a curve, and Bernanke gets an A, where does that leave me? Are you asking? This is second question. Pardon me?
What grade would you give Bernanke for getting the curve?
Well, that's what, I've answered that question.
Thank you so much for your remarks. As public policy students, we're very interested in this question of implementation of ideas, and I would be interested to hear your thoughts on how much or what specifically we can learn from business management and business administration, and how much you think the problems of public policy management are really unique.
I'm sorry, but
So she wants to know, so as policy students, they're interested in management and implementation.
good.
And but she wants
Thank
to
you.
know how much, if they were to study what businesses do, can they apply that to the public sector, or is the public sector very
Well,
different?
it's a good question, and I don't know if it has a general answer. In some cases, yes, in some cases, no. I think government responsibilities are different from business responsibilities, but some things they do overlap. Taking the example, a simple example is Social Security checks and so forth. Well, private industry does a lot of those kinds of things too. So there undoubtedly overlaps in operational responsibilities. One of the big challenges, I believe, for government, which is kind of a mess now, as near as I can understand, is when it is appropriate to outsource, when is it appropriate to contract a governmental function elsewhere. And the rules and practices on that are not very clear, to say the least. And some of the incentives are just, they're not irrelevant politically, but they're irrelevant in getting something done, such as no administration wants to say they're adding government employees. So instead, they hire people outside. They hire sometimes 3 people where a good government employee could have done it. Do we have good enough people in the government, highly sophisticated managers who know how to control and judge the outside contractors? And that's an increasing problem. And then you've got all kinds of philosophical problems. Do we really want to hire Hessians to fight our wars, which we seem to be doing these days to some extent? That's a big issue that I want the Alliance to take up, but it won't be this year. And it's a big issue in other countries as well. It's an issue where we need a lot of rethinking. It's a good place for an academic institution to lay some groundwork.
In a similar question, I've heard some propose that compensating federal regulators comparable salaries to Wall Street bankers would help agencies become more competitive. What do you think about that?
When I look at salaries they're getting paid these days, it's 4 times what I got paid, and so maybe the policies are better. There is it's another area where some thinking needs to be done. How much do you want to pay them? You can go to the extreme, and people say, look at Singapore. Singapore has the record of being highly efficient in the implementation of public services. The top administrators in Singapore, including the head of their monetary authorities, makes more than $1 million a year. Now, the United States politically is not going to go there, I do not believe. And there's been some relaxation in recent years. But it is true, take in particular the area of bank examiners and bank supervisors, where they, I don't know what the range is now, but I don't think they'd be making, at the outside, the top people might be making close to $200,000. But they can go off to the banking system and make 5 times that or 10 times that. And that's why you see all these congressional people going into a lobbying firm. And the supervisor isn't going to be a lobbyist. He's going to go to the bank itself and make a lot more money. And there's got to be some balance, and you've got to encourage a feeling, and this is important, that public service is a special trust. And that some people are willing to take considerable satisfaction in that, and they are willing to sit there and make a career or a large part of a career at pay that doesn't compare with what you get outside. But on the other side, they do want to send their child to Princeton. And, you know, paying 30% of your salary for one child to Princeton isn't much fun. So, you know, there are things on, it's an area, another area that needs work. It's very ragged now. Different agencies do it differently. There is some common government rules, but they are violated or changed in some cases. It is an area that goes to the heart of personnel practices. The biggest complaint I hear about, and this is really sad, and I'm sure you feel it, people that are interested in going into government, they've been to the Woodrow Wilson School, they've been to Harvard, been to Maxwell, they've been other places. They want to go to government. They've got a government agency that wants to hire them. And the amount of time it takes between the kind of basic decision, yes, I want to go there, and yes, we want to have you, is probably 8 months before they finally can get through the personnel process. And how many kids getting out of graduate school or college can sit around waiting 8 months before they finally get through the personnel process and actually get hired for, and there's certainly a salary problem at that level. So you're bringing up questions that are, it's the reason I created this institute, to examine those kinds of questions.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. I was wondering what, if anything, the Federal Reserve could do to increase the transparency on its forward-looking strategy, especially with regard to unconventional stimulus, like changes in quantitative easing. We're seeing the latest round of the tapering.
Look forward, who are you talking about now? The federal government?
Reserve. What they could do to increase transparency.
I mean, my hobby horse at the moment, growing out of this other task force that I mentioned, is that state government finances are idiosyncratic, to say the least, depending upon what state you're looking at. It's hard work figuring out what the revenues really are and the expenditures really are, because they can all get hoaxed around. They move revenues from one year to another, expenditure one year or another. They sell the state capital and lease it back. And some states, you know, if you find a friendly underwriter, he'll fix up the debt so it doesn't look like debt, and you count it as revenues. And you don't pay your pension. That's the biggest single hole in state and local governments. And New Jersey for a while just didn't pay the pensions at all. They got way back. New York has a better record, but New York is making its pension payments these days by borrowing from the pension fund. That's not exactly an independent source of money. They borrow from the pension fund at 3%. And the pension fund is discounting its liabilities at 8%. Doesn't add up. I mean, that is the kind of thing that needs attention. It needs some discipline so that the population knows, the citizens knows, the legislature knows, hey, our pension is way underwater, and we shouldn't permit that to happen. Or you end up with Detroit, or you end up with San Jose, California, or some other cities in California that are actually bankrupt. Puerto Rico. Why these Puerto Rico and Detroit have been underwater in any sensible accounting for years, but not the way you look at it, and it's, I mean, not the way it was looked at. So that's a big problem. We got more problems than I got institutes for, right?
At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the influence of lobbyists, and also the Supreme Court seemed to have opened the doors for more ways for people to, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the influence of people lobbying the government, and also not too long ago, the Supreme Court opened the doors for more money to come in for campaigns. And I was wondering, from all the experience you've had in the government, what kinds of maybe regulations can be put in place to diminish that so that people who are supposed to be concerned about the public do?
It is a very big issue which we have not taken on. And other people have taken it on. Maybe someday we will. But I hope others do take it on. Others have tried. Campaign financing and lobbying. It's become, you know, lobbying, it can be useful, done constructively. Congress is not perfect in writing laws. The administration is not perfect in writing laws, and they need advice from the people affected. But when it becomes an overwhelmingly money proposition, and what's made it an overwhelming money proposition is the cost of campaign financing. They're just obsessed with how you finance the next campaign. And when the friendly lobbyist is there and his parting words at the office, oh, yes, Representative, and we're all working on that campaign dinner that I told you about, and so forth, it's a problem. And, you know, I'm obviously not the first person to say that. And it's well known, but doing something about it, take it on. What are you going to do? You know, what strikes me, you get the ramblings here of an old man, but Washington is so different just in physical environment than when I was first there 20 or 30 years ago, when it was considered there were only two good restaurants, one steakhouse and one French restaurant that Kennedy went to. There was one luxury hotel built in the 60s. Law firms typically were local, and they were prestigious, and they may have a floor in an office building. Now every sizable law firm in the country has an office in Washington, and they don't have a floor in the office building, they own the whole office building. And at the biggest ones own two office buildings. And you just go down there, the whole landscape has changed. And what are they filled with? They're not, you know, they have a bank or two, but they don't amount to anything. They're filled with lobbyists and law firms. And physically, it's overwhelming to me in terms of what it was not very many decades ago, and it's just reflective of the amount of money put into this system now.
Thank you for coming. So my question is, if you were say a policy student at the Woodrow Wilson School, a policy student here, and you were interested in this question of implementation, of how to do that better, what kind of courses, what kind of things would you be thinking about to prepare yourself for that? And are there things that just have to be learned on the job that you can't learn in a classroom?
I want to tell you all, there's some privileges that go with age. But it is true, when you get a little hard of hearing, it is a physical fact that women's voices have higher frequencies than men's voices.
Try again.
And the hearing for high frequency is difficult.
So she's interested in, she's a policy student, so you're free were
Good.
policy, as you once were. If you're interested in implementation, what courses would you take in order to prepare? Or are there skills that you have to learn on the job that cannot be taught?
Well, an excellent question, and that is an area which we hope to be working on. We're going to have an advisory group of leading schools of public administration, public policy, precisely to answer those questions, or try to answer those questions. And I touched upon one aspect of it in the remarks I made in a sentence or two. There is a feeling that much more might be done in encouraging internships, that there is a demand for that from governments, and maybe not so much from the federal government, but from state governments and local governments, in getting some hands-on people who come in that are smart and able and are looking for experience and can be used. And I don't want them closing up bridges on the George Washington Bridge. I mean, you got to somehow do better than that. But I think there are opportunities. That's one thing that sparks a lot of interest among some schools. The other thing is, do we have to do this all in the classroom, or isn't there a big opportunity here for off-campus education, which arises in other areas as well? But maybe this is a particularly ripe area where you don't need the people, even if you've got the on-campus program, maybe that should be no more than a year or 9 months or 6 months, and you do something off-campus. All those things deserve some rethinking. I haven't got the answer, but that's the kind of thing that can be looked at. I mean, God, all these questions you ask, all I ended up saying, well, they're nice questions, but I can't answer them all. I mean, this one theme keeps coming to my mind. God, if I were only 80 again, I could.
Thank you.
We still got questions here.
Hi, thanks for coming to speak to us today. It strikes me that we've been in the discussion of governance, we talked a lot about institutional design and red tape.
Yes.
And in light of the fact that the government was recently put to a halt by a political faction and group, I was wondering to what extent you feel that good governance is influenced by politics, political culture, political dialogue or lack thereof, and what the implications are for that moving forward on good governance? Or do you feel that this is par for the course? Politics have always been difficult, and really it is a question of institutional design and eliminating red tape. Thank you.
Again, I'm not going to have the answer to all these questions, but the kind of questions that have just been asked recently are precisely the kinds of questions, Cecilia, these are precisely the kinds of questions that the Woodrow Wilson School ought to be thinking about. And, they are very important questions.
We have political scientists that are working.
You may not solve war and peace, but you ought to be able to solve this kind of problem. I'll make a contribution.
This is another related question, but could you speak to how your experience and your time at Princeton specifically shaped your perspective on a career in public policy?
Again.
Well, this is a great final question, which was, can you speak about how your experience at Princeton shaped your career in public policy and influenced your career in public policy? What are all the great things you learned here at Princeton?
Well, the great secret of my career can be replicated by many college graduates. I got out of Princeton and what am I going to do? Well, you can go to law school. So I applied to Harvard Law School and Yale Law School. But maybe I want to become an economist. My professor foolishly said I ought to go and become an economist. So I applied to Harvard Graduate School. I didn't want to stay at Princeton and go to Harvard. And then I saw a notice in the, I don't know where I saw it. It's something called the Harvard Graduate School of Public Administration gave out, I think, 10 or 12 fellowships a year to new college graduates. And that fellowship was for twice as much money as I ever would have expected to get from either the law school or the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. So I said, I want to go to the Harvard Graduate School, Public Administration, and I could put off the real decision because I could take economics there, as you could in the Woodrow Wilson School. But I've always been kind of, halfway in between. And I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea, but that Harvard school was in a similar situation to the Woodrow Wilson School here. After the Woodrow Wilson School got a lot of money. Now, Harvard didn't have that kind of money, but it had some money. But it was a similar thing, kind of closely connected with the political science department and the economics department. So you got a flavor of whatever you wanted. But I find graduates are inclined to make the decision based upon who pays them the most money when they get out of college so they can repay the student loans. I remember the first, all we're doing is gossiping, and this is the end. When I arrived at Princeton, after I was in Federal Reserve and I spent some years here, I had an office across the way here, an empty office. Somebody knocked on the door, a student knocked on the door. He says, could I talk to you? I want some advice. And I said, well, I'm here to give advice. And come in. He said, I got some job offers on Wall Street between these different firms. Which firm do you recommend? And I said, well, what's your background? Why are you interested in this? He said, I'm just getting my PhD in aeronautical engineering. And I said, what are you doing going to Wall Street? You just got a PhD in aeronautical. He looked at me as if I came from the moon. He said, don't you understand? I can go to Boeing tomorrow, and I will make $45,000 a year, or whatever it was 20 years ago. And I can work there 30 years, and I've got a gold watch, and I'll be making $75,000 a year. And if I go with Goldman Sachs, I'll be making $125,000 the first year. Where do you think I'm going to go? I'm going to go to, it's just, and that, I don't know if that's quite so strong now, but for 20 years, the pull of Wall Street toward college graduates, particularly maybe people that take economics and computer science and that stuff, is enormous. I think that's diminishing a bit, which is a healthy sign so far as I can see. So.
Well, thank you so much.